Hey, so if you know me, one of the things you know about me is that I love Jurassic Park. Jurassic World, all the movies, every one of them, I love them all. And in fact, I love all things dinosaurs. People buy me little dinosaur things periodically, and I like having them around. Well, as a Christian, dinosaurs can create a problem. In fact, they create a problem both for Christians and for evolutionists. They're just one of those things that creates a problem. However, Christians as a whole have studied where dinosaurs fit into things far less than evolutionists who study that a lot. And so that leaves us with a lot of problems. Because one of the problems that we have is if you believe that the Bible is a literal book, which you should be believing that if you're a believer, then we have to believe that the Genesis account of creation and all of the following genealogies are correct, that they are as listed. And that creates a problem because that means that you would have to believe in a young earth, which is one that is less than 10,000 years old, which I do. And that's where dinosaurs create a problem. And that's where the study of dinosaurs kind of comes in and why I wanted to do this study on dinosaurs. Now, this is going to be kind of a long video and different than what I would normally do. But I believe that it's important for us to understand and have an understanding of how dinosaurs fit into history and how they fit into the Bible. Because if we start to believe the Bible literally, like I said, we believe the earth is less than 10,000 years, it would also mean that dinosaurs would have had to have coexisted with people. And that would also mean that there would have to have been the flood and that the dinosaur fossil record should give evidence of a flood. And it would also mean that these fossils that are dated 65 million years old, that would be wrong. So what we're looking at when we look at the problem that dinosaurs bring to Christians is that it flies in the face of most what's taught in schools, what's taught in universities, what's accepted as truth to the secular world, to evolutionists in particular. And well, we want to look at that and find out, does the Bible talk about dinosaurs? How would they fit in? What does the scientific evidence show us about dinosaurs? So I wanted to tell you that, first of all, this is kind of the book where I'm getting a lot of this information from. Hopefully the author, Brian Thomas, is okay with me making this video, but I'm not going to go through this book in its entirety. Even though it's a small book, that would be an extremely long video. But this book, Dinosaurs in the Bible, fantastic book. I would highly recommend it. If you look at this video and you think, man, I really like this, this is a great starting place. Super short, very easy to read. He does a wonderful job. So thank you, Brian Thomas, for this book. Well, I mean, I bought the book. He didn't give it to me. But I thank you for writing this book. Anyways, let's just get into it. So I'm going to break this down into sections. So, as I'm going through a section, don't be thinking, oh my gosh, what about this? What about this? Hopefully, I'll address that at some point throughout this. I guess I'll call this a Bible study, although it's going to be a little while. Well, we're going to look at the Bible quite a bit through it, but it's less of a study of the Bible, more of an apologetics kind of thing. So the first question is, when did dinosaurs live? So evolutionists would declare that the dinosaurs died out about 65 million years ago. If you watch Jurassic Park like I do, I think the tagline, the tagline of the movie is a movie 65 million years in the making, right? So, but that contradicts a biblical worldview of creation, which says that the earth is between 7,000 and 10,000 years old. So let's go back and look at according to creation in Genesis. So it says in Genesis that God made the sea and the air creatures on day 5 and the beasts of the land on day 6. And if we're looking at Genesis, the account of creation as a literal 7 days, then it means that on day 5, all the sea and air creatures were made, and on day 6, all the land creatures were made. This is in Genesis chapter 1, verses 20 through 25. Then God said, "Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens." So God created great sea creatures, and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." So the evening and the morning were the 5th day. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth, each according to its kind." And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw it was good. So in Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, which we just read, uses a word that is probably pronounced something like tanium. Now, I don't know how to pronounce words that I don't know, but that's okay. So we're just going to say tanium is T-A-N-N-I-Y-M. And some people translate this as a whale. In fact, there are some Bible translations that use the word whale, but a better translation would actually be sea monster. So in other words, this is where it says, "So God created great sea creatures according to every living thing that moves." And that sea creatures, sea monster, sea creatures, this is a much better translation than whale. If you were to look at this from Strong's Concordance, it says it is an intensive from the same as another word. It's a marine or land monster. That is a sea serpent, a dragon, a sea monster, or a serpent. When you start to look at things like the mosasaur, which if you saw Jurassic World, it's that one that jumps up and eats that shark at the very, the part where they're doing sort of the show before everything breaks loose. Mosasaurs grow to about 50 feet in length, and they have been found off of every single continent in the entire world. The plesiosaur grows to more than 50 feet and has a very long neck. Looks very similar to pictures that you would see of, say, the Loch Ness Monster. So these were actual dinosaurs that exist, and to me, they would fit that definition of sea monster, sea creature. Then as it goes on, it says beasts, and that would include land dinosaurs. There were flying birds, and the word flying birds, because dinosaurs are not birds, even despite the trajectory that the Jurassic Park movies have been taking. Flying birds, the word actually means flapping animals or something covered with wings. So that would actually include pterosaurs, which is like your pterodon or pterodactyl, those winged dinosaurs that fly around. So just because it says flying birds, that word actually means just anything that flies or anything that has wings was created on that day. So within the context of the creation story, we actually see that all of the dinosaurs could have been included in the animals that God created. There's no category that's left out. Now, dinosaurs are reptilian, basically, but they're not actually reptiles. They differ from reptiles by the way that their legs attach to their bodies. Reptiles, their legs kind of extend to the side. If you've ever seen a lizard, their legs come out from the side, then bend down. Dinosaurs, though, have legs that are more like humans or dogs, where the legs actually extend directly down from their bodies. Whether you're talking about, something like this, where like a Tyrannosaurus Rex, where their legs go, straight down. They walk more upright, more human-esque, although not too human-esque. Or you have something like an ankylosaur, which, is kind of dog-shaped, even though they look nothing like a dog, but the legs are attached directly to the bottom. They don't go straight out and down. If you think like a bearded lizard or any lizard that you've seen, that's how they do. So they actually have some different makeup than reptiles, but they're cold-blooded and they have scales, which are actually just folds of skin that sort of die and harden and then fold over themselves and die and harden and create these scales. So in that sense, they are reptile-like, but they're not actually reptiles. They would be distinctly of their own kind. So each animal was made according to its own kind. That's one of the things that Genesis brings about. And when Noah brought the animals onto his ark, it says that he brought animals according to their kind on the ark. So in Genesis chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, it says, "And of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. And you shall take for yourself of all food that is eaten, and you shall gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them." So the next thing we want to talk about here is I mean, there's so many things to unpack, so trying to pick an order was somewhat difficult, but I want to look at the problem of the ark, because the dinosaurs would have had to fit on the ark. If the Bible is true and dinosaurs were part of creation and dinosaurs lived with men, then dinosaurs would have had to have been on the ark, because it doesn't say to bring 2 of every kind but leave off the giant ones or anything like that. So we need to look at dinosaurs on the ark. Well, there's a lot of problems that they create. There's a lot of these dinosaurs, particularly the pteropods. I'll come back to that. I think that's what they're called. Things like Tyrannosaurus, Allosaurus, Giganotosaurus would be very violent, dangerous creatures to have on board your ark. So that creates a problem. Size overall would be a problem. So let's see if there's a way to address this. Well, before the fall, all dinosaurs were vegetarian. We generally accept that before the fall of man, all animals were vegetarian. Because there was no killing, there was no bloodshed up to that point. And by Genesis 6, which is after the flood, we see that the earth is full of animal violence and, honestly, people violence too. In Genesis 7, verses 14 through 15, it indicates that dinosaurs were on the ark. Let's read that. Genesis 7, 14 through 15. They and every beast after its kind, all cattle after their kind, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, every bird after its kind, and every bird of every sort. And they went into the ark to Noah, 2 by 2, of all flesh, which is the breath of life. Of all flesh, in which is the breath of life. So it says everything. Everything that had breath, which dinosaurs would have had breath, got on the ark. Well, so first of all, how could they fit? When mammals are born, they are significantly bigger than reptile babies. There's only about 60 kinds of dinosaurs, and the largest, which is the Diplodocus, at about 16 tons, when it's born into an egg, and that egg is about the size of a football, and the whole dinosaur fits inside something about that big. Most of the animals would have been much smaller, significantly smaller, down to tennis ball sized, and even smaller than that for some of the smaller dinosaurs. Many of the species of dinosaurs, even at full grown, were the size of a chicken. One of the things that Jurassic Park unfortunately got wrong is velociraptors were about the size of chickens, not like 6 feet tall like they portrayed them in the movie. There is a particular raptor called a Utahraptor, which was about that big, but that's not what they portrayed in the movie. They just made them bigger because a chicken-sized dinosaur chasing you is not as scary as a 6-foot dinosaur chasing you. So they took some liberties there. But many of them, like the Diplodocus at 16 tons, is a large animal. We've been to the museums, we've seen the skeletons. But when they're born, they're tiny. They're really tiny. And in fact, even though when you buy a children's set of Noah's Ark with little characters and stuff, they always give you full-grown animals, elephants and giraffes and everything else, it's way more probable that all the animals that came onto the ark were babies. Maybe just weaned if they were mammals. Reptiles could just come out right out of the egg. And they were all on the ark for about a year. Well, after a year, even the Diplodocus, the largest of all dinosaurs, was estimated to only be about the size of a sheep. So the size of dinosaurs is really not a problem if we consider that they just brought baby dinosaurs onto the ark. And it would make way more sense to have brought baby all animals onto the ark, which also addresses some of the violence problem. Because most animals during their first year or definitely first little bit, carnivores actually mostly just want milk. And they don't eat meat. And also babies are much easier to keep from being violent. Well, baby animals, baby humans. Anyways, well, so, and then you think about, well, what about the T-Rex? Because even a juvenile T-Rex, wouldn't they just eat everyone? Well, first of all, most likely they would have reverted to their vegetarian diet. Noah would have only brought vegetables and grasses and things like that onto the ark, not other meats for them to eat. And so they would not have been on meat yet anyways, with as young as they were, and he just never introduced them to meat during their formative year. With the T-Rex, there's actually an indication in the Bible that animals had no issues with people until after the flood. That prior to the flood, animals didn't attack people. And we don't have any record of animal attacks in the Bible until after the flood. And there's this verse in Genesis 9:2 that says, "And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, and on all that move on the earth, and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand." And so it would seem that in Genesis 9, which is 2 chapters after the flood, that God kind of changes the relationship between man and animal to where man now completely dominates animals and they now fear and have dread of man, which is honestly most animals. There's very few animals that will attack unprovoked, if any. Generally, it's because of fear that they will attack people. But because they have that fear, they will do it. But that doesn't seem to have happened until after the flood. But regardless, even if some people don't see that as evidence of animal violence, it's more likely that the animals were on an all-vegetarian diet while they were on the ark during the flood. So, what happened to the dinosaurs? Since there aren't any dinosaurs living right now, wouldn't that be proof of evolution? In other words, they've evolved and become something else. Well, first of all, there are no species that would have led up to dinosaurs. There are no evolutionary traces of where they would have come from or where they would have gone. There's nothing that's like a precursor to a dinosaur and nothing that would appear to be a dinosaur after. There are some very, very far stretches that people have supposed, but there is no evidence. There's no fossils that have been found, no drawings that have been found, nothing that has been found to say this is what a dinosaur came from or what it has become. Pterosaurs are flying reptiles. So they would have been created on day 5 with the flying creatures. And pterosaurs have what's called a retractable pteroid bone on the fold of each wing. And they're able to use that to walk on the land. Basically, their wing folds and there's this bone here that allows them to walk. Otherwise, the wing would just collapse and wouldn't have enough strength. So they use it to walk on land. But that bone, when extended, also moves and it allows them to control their flight at low speeds. If it wasn't for that bone, then when they were flying at low speeds, they would probably just drop out of the air, but it enables them to keep control. There's no other creature like this. There's no evolutionary track that would lead to these creatures. There's no other creature that would have needed some precursor to that. How could that have just evolved out of nothing, like just to appear and yet be so perfect in what its function is and what it's able to do? There are 0 evolutionary transitional fossils found. So it makes way more scientific sense to say that dinosaurs were created that way rather than that they would have evolved that way. In 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted and it destroyed thousands of acres covering it in lava, and that lava turned to rock. And scientists at that time estimated that it would take over 100 years for growth to really take off and another 100 years to fully cover the rocks, replenish the animal life, and make it so that you couldn't tell that something happened. Their estimate was literally like 200 years before you would be able to forget this eruption of Mount St. Helens. Well, within 30 years, the area was replete with vegetation and animals, and it was impossible to tell where the eruption had even occurred. In fact, if you go there now, there are signs, and this just happened in 1980. They have signs explaining what happened, where the eruption occurred, and what it looked like, because if you go there now, you cannot tell. Scientists do not have a good track record with accuracy. I'm just going to say it right now. That is absolutely true. Scientists have a terrible track record of accuracy. You know, they didn't believe in germs before germs were discovered. They didn't believe in space before that was discovered. They didn't believe that you could fly before the Wright brothers did it. It's just, and they believe things like if you traveled more than 30 miles an hour, you'd probably explode. Just all kind of things that scientists have postulated and theorized. But for some reason, when it comes to evolution, and there's very little evidence to support it, people have bought into it hook, line, and sinker. But it's not true. So another question would be, what about the Ice Age? Well, in Genesis 13:10, it says, "And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere." And this is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. "It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go toward Zoar." So here is Lot in the Middle East, Israel area, and everything right now there is desert, like this total desert land. But he's looking at it and describing this, that it looks like the garden of the Lord, that there's water everywhere. And it's just beautiful. Well, this is indication that after the flood, we entered into a short ice age. With the earth being completely covered in water, it would have cooled the core temperature of the earth down after a year of being covered in water. And it's likely that that resulted in an ice age. Then that immediately after the waters receded, the temperatures would have started rising, causing the melt-offs of this ice age, which would have caused the hottest areas of the world to melt first, so all of the deserts. But because they're in melting process, they will be the most well-watered, abundant, full of life, green places. And this is what Lot's describing in Genesis 13. But one of the problems is that as the ice age rescinded, this would have begun changing habitats dramatically. And as the land dried, so would have the dinosaurs' habitats. And so it's likely that the dinosaurs simply stopped existing at some point because their habitats were changing so much. And when a habitat changes, the larger the animal is, the less likely it is to be able to adapt to a changing habitat. And that's true across the board. Insects don't have too much of a problem adapting, but elephants do, and dinosaurs would have really had a problem adapting to the changing environment. So most likely what happened to the dinosaurs is they changed off because of that. But let's actually take a look at, if the dinosaurs were on the ark, then what happened to them after the ark and where are they now? Well, first of all, let's go ahead and address the fact that there were dinosaurs after the ark. There are glyphs in China, the Middle East, the Americas, and Antarctica that indicate dinosaurs. We have drawings with people and dinosaurs together. We have reports of St. George, who says he's slain a dragon in the Middle East in AD 200. Keep in mind that the word dinosaur didn't come about until much later, I wish I could remember. It was either late 1800s or early 1900s. Before that, people referred to them as dragons. And so a lot of the lore of dragons is actually probably directly related to dinosaurs. We have images on pottery, on walls, on all kinds of things dating back into the BC era of pictures of dinosaurs. But we didn't actually start digging for fossils and start digging up dinosaur fossils and putting together skeletons and figuring out dinosaurs until the 1800s. Up until then, we didn't have those. So how did people have pictures, well, not photographs, but drawings, pottery, artwork, sculptures of animals that look exactly like our dinosaurs now if they'd never seen one? So more likely is that the people that did the pottery, that made those things, had actually seen dinosaurs. And that's why they were depicting them in their artwork. We aren't depicting things in our artwork that don't exist, that one day someone will discover that it did exist. And then, that's ridiculous to think about. So it's way more likely that the reason dinosaurs show up in artwork is because people saw them with their own eyes. The Chinese zodiac, it features dragons living right alongside standard animals. So why are they mixing in dragons, which people would say didn't exist at that time, with rabbits and foxes and oxen that do exist, or did exist, still do exist? Well, the chances are that when the zodiac was first created, there were dragons, which would be dinosaurs. This is a writing from 1405 AD. So, not that long ago. We're well into the ADs. This is only less than 1,000 years ago. It says, close to the town of Burrs, near Sudbury, there has lately appeared to the great herd of the countryside a dragon, vast in body, with a crested head, teeth like a saw, and a tail extending to an enormous length. Having slaughtered the shepherd of the flock, it devoured many sheep, In order to destroy him, all the country people were summoned. But when the dragon saw that he was again to be assailed with arrows, he fled into a marsh or mere and there hid himself among the long reeds and was seen no more. You know, that's actually someone describing a town rising up to fight off a beast that it would have taken an entire countryside to get. This sounds like a dinosaur to me. Marco Polo described his encounter with a dragon in China during the Middle Ages. There are more than 20 ceratopsian dinosaur designs with lots of horns. So a ceratopsian, this is a triceratops. Can you see that? That's a triceratops because he has 3 horns. Well, he's ceratopsian because the triceratops became the most famous of the ceratopsians, but there's some with all kind of number of horns. It doesn't have to just be 3. Some of them had 10, 20, whatever. Well, there's all kind of dinosaur designs that are ceratopsian, and many of them have horns that encircle their entire head. Well, that looks exactly like what the Chinese depiction of a dragon is. So it's like someone may have seen one and then created their dragon drawings from a triceratops, which is much more, well, not a triceratops, but like a ceratopsian, one in the same family as a triceratops, but with maybe 20 horns that surrounded its head. So what happened to the dinosaurs? If we have dinosaur, evidence of dinosaurs existing all the way up into the Middle Ages, where are they today? Well, they went extinct the same way most animals have gone extinct. Loss of habitat and people hunting them. There are tons and tons of stories of people who are looking for a trophy of a dinosaur, a dragon head, something, because that would be fantastic to have. In fact, that was the whole premise of Jurassic Park 3. Can't remember if it was The Lost World or Jurassic Park 3. I should know this. I'm like their #1 fan. But anyways, it was the hunters come in and they're trying to hunt. It was The Lost World. They wanted to hunt dinosaurs to get a T-Rex trophy. All right, let's look at the fossils. Dinosaur fossils and the problems that they create. Let's start off with this. When a scientist has to answer a question of something that they don't know, in other words, let's say we find a dinosaur bone, but we don't know where it came from. The way that works is first the scientist needs to construct a model to figure it out. And from there, they would create a hypothesis to test. So in other words, what you do as a scientist is you would look at your problem that you have to figure out, and you would essentially make something up. Now, I say make something up, they should be educated. Like, these are brilliant minds, so they're not just like making something up, but they're using the best of the knowledge that they have to sort of explain it. And then what they do is they create a hypothesis, and in that hypothesis, they would have some way to test it to see if their hypothesis is true or not. So when they do that, and they create this model that they're going to test, you always do it through your worldview. Now, this is true of scientists. This is true of everybody in life. Even me, as a Christian and a Bible scholar, I look at things through a biblical filter. So my worldview always includes the Bible. And so when I look at something, it has to fit into my worldview. Well, an evolutionist has an evolutionary worldview. And so everything that they model has to sort of fit into their worldview. See, as people, we're not able to think outside of our worldview. Until our worldview gets expanded, we keep everything pretty narrow into that. Some people say that's like looking through your own filter. Some people refer to it as other things, but basically it's we always think and act according to our worldview. Well, scientists do this too. And evidence is always interpreted according to our worldview. It's very easy for two people to look at the same evidence and draw different conclusions from it if those two people don't share the same worldview. Well, dinosaur fossils are almost always found in bone beds. This idea, like we see on Indiana Jones, of people discovering one relic somewhere, or other places where you've seen digs, like in Jurassic Park, and they're brushing a perfectly preserved dinosaur skeleton and being very careful, that's not the way most fossils are found. Generally, they're found in what's called a bone bed, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a bed filled with bones of all types of other mammals, reptiles, birds, dinosaurs, people, there's just a whole host of bones all mixed in together. And some of these bone beds extend for miles. In fact, there are some that extend for hundreds of miles. Well, creationists, people who believe in the Bible's form of the world's beginning, they attribute this to a worldwide flood that would have deposited large collection of the remains in the same location. You know, figure all these bones are picked up because they're of similar density. They sort of group together, and then when the waters receded, they're plopped and landed somewhere. Evolutionists have a much harder time trying to depict how bone beds formed. They attribute it to a large, maybe localized flood, maybe like a river that, what do they call it? Like goes past its banks, overflows its banks, and would have deposited everything into one location. And this happened in multiple places all over the earth. You know, basically anything that would distribute a large amount of sand and earth into a similar location, then all that would have contained bones within it. I think that the flood makes way more sense, but again, like I said, I speak from a biblical worldview. And evolutionists, they have to look at pinpointed floods that would have been very epic in nature, like citywide floods or even statewide floods, you know, that kind of size all over the world. But I'd just say it was one giant worldwide flood as depicted in Genesis. Realize that evolution was not even a theory until 1859. Until then, no one, or maybe only a handful of people, would have ever even believed the Earth to be older than 6,000 to 9,000 years old. Pretty much no one believed in an old Earth or the idea that things could have been billions of years old or even millions of years old. That just wouldn't have existed until 1859 when the first theses came out. And that was actually just a precursor to Darwin. And then, of course, Darwin published The Origin of Species, which caused people to start looking at things in a different way. And but before that, the idea of the flood, even to secularists, they all believed it because there was so much evidence suggesting that there was a flood, and there's no evidence suggesting that the Earth is older than 10,000 years old. Well, people argue against the flood for the distribution of, or people who do argue against the flood for the distribution of bones argue that a worldwide flood would have been too chaotic to leave layers. So when you're digging through a bone bed, they're always kind of sorted by layers. And even the Earth's crust is organized in density by layers, suggesting a flood. But they believe that if there was a worldwide flood, it would have been extremely chaotic, which they're not wrong. I mean, it would have been. It would not have just been like a floating pond over the Earth. It would have been huge, just devastating waves, you know, massive storms. It would have been very chaotic. They argue that layers can't happen in chaos because it's constantly being stirred. And so when the waters recede, it would all be mixed up together, not formed in layers. But when we look at fossils, everything seems to be organized by layers. Well, the problem with that theory is that doesn't take into account dirty waters. In a worldwide flood, that would be extremely dirty waters. Anything that's stirring up the bottom, you know, the ocean and all the trees and everything that would have been in that water, you would have very, very dirty waters. They've done experiments, and dirty waters, even as chaotic as they can get, always leaves layers. And in fact, going back to Mount St. Helens, the lava that was flowing over 100 miles an hour. But as it left, because it was so dirty, it was leaving layers, and the entire strata that was formed from that came out in layers. So the flood lasted for about 1 year. And this model is simply the simplest explanation for bone graveyards, bone beds, and the sedimentary layers of the Earth. And those that oppose the flood in the Genesis account have to create far more complex models to account for what happened. And it's funny to me because one of the standing rules in science has been that a general rule is that the simplest explanation is always the right explanation. But for evolutionists to believe in evolution and to look and to deny a worldwide flood and to deny a young Earth, they have to create extremely complex models that keep creating additional problems that they have to keep creating additional models for and additional models for. And still to this day, there's still no consensus that there's evidence to actually say that evolution could have happened. In fact, there's evidence against an old Earth. There's a famous dinosaur fossil dig in Glendive, Montana, where dinosaur remains have been discovered that contain original blood vessels and cells and other proteins. Well, proteins can only last for thousands of years, maybe even up to 100,000 years. but they definitely cannot last for millions, let alone 65 million years. And yet they're still there. In fact, there are lots of dinosaur digs and bones and fossils, over 40 that we know of, that have complete blood vessels and proteins and other things still intact. And by evolutionary means, that is physically absolutely impossible. There's no case where you could have proteins lasting for 65 million years. Could never happen. At this same site, it's relatively easy to dig up fossils. In fact, you could just go with your hands. Most places you would have to use tools to really get in and do it, but this bone bed is just soft. So the reason that it's soft is because sagebrush has grown and the roots extend past the fossil layer and they go into underwater streams. That water then leaches out of the roots as it goes through the fossils. And the plants extract minerals from the soil for nourishment. Well, because these roots are going all around these fossils and are grabbing nutrients and things, and fossils have a lot of calcium in it, which plants take, it would not take too long for these sagebrush plants to have destroyed all the fossil remains this way. And when I say not too long, I'm not talking weeks, I'm talking like thousands of years. But it would take, it would only take a few thousand years for the sagebrush roots to destroy the bones and the fossil records. Yet they still exist. And the reason for that is because they simply haven't been there for millions of years like people want us to believe. There are also many other bone fragments and fossils found here belonging to non-extinct species, and they're all mixed in together. And of course, like the animals that we have today, most evolutionists would say didn't exist at the same time as the dinosaurs. Yet here their bones are just all mixed in together. Creationists are not surprised by this. Evolutionists still have no explanation for this dig site. In Dinosaur Valley, there are prints of dinosaurs walking in a straight line, and no prints overlap. There are also no baby dinosaur prints. There's also no short dinosaur prints, meaning like, a shorter dinosaur versus a taller dinosaur. In fact, most of the only dinosaurs that they found are sauropods, which would be like your Brontosaurus, Brachiosaur, Diplodocus, Argentinosaurus. Anyways, those are the only ones that are found. And there's no good explanation for why this single file line of dinosaur prints that don't overlap is, except for one. This would be around the apex of the flood, where most dinosaurs would have died out, except for this one lone dinosaur and all the babies, of course, would have already drowned because they would have been shorter. And so only the tallest of the tallest dinosaur that didn't go on the ark was still alive. And this dinosaur is basically in duress, trying to escape. And that would explain why the footprints are as they are. And it would also show that as the floodwaters would have rapidly deposited clay and minerals, it would have trapped those footprints in the mud, fossilizing those footprints and creating those tracks of the dinosaurs. So in Dinosaur Valley, what you're probably looking at when you see the lone set of sauropod footprints going off is a dinosaur that was simply trying to escape an impending death. It's kind of a sad story, but it's evidence of a young Earth. Evolutionists now argue that dinosaurs may have evolved into birds. I'm saddened that this theory is proclaimed widely through my favorite set of movies, but movies have faults. So anyways, they say that there's evidence of feathered dinosaurs. And I would just want you to first of all know that's absolutely ridiculous. There were no feathered dinosaurs. They say that that is the case because of striations, or basically these stringy fibers that they have found on the skin that were in certain preserved mummified remains, which also, by the way, those mummified remains present a problem because 65 million years old, you wouldn't have mummified remains. But you could thousands of years old, the same way we have like the mummified remains of King Tut, Tutankhamun, and some other Egyptian mummies, because those are thousands of years old, not millions of years old. So, but these stringy fibers were found, and those same stringy fibers are what you find in birds. So it's particularly like where they're feathered. So you wouldn't find it on their legs, where they're not feathered, but anywhere they're feathered, they have these like striations and stringy fibers on their skin. Well, there's something else that's required for a feather. Besides, these aren't even required for feathers. These are just there. But there is something that is required for a feather, and that's a follicle. You must have a hole in your skin for the feather to stick into, and it must be a hole in the bone where the feather attaches. Somehow those feathers are attached to the bird so that they don't, first time they flap their wing, they don't go poof, and all the feathers fly off of them. So not one single piece of dinosaur skin, fossil, bone, anything that has ever been found has ever had a follicle in it. Dinosaurs don't have follicles because dinosaurs never had feathers. So how do we explain the stringy fibers? Well, if you take reptile skin and if you were to soak it into water for about a year, as it erodes, you get those same stringy fibers on the skin. It's basically the skin being pulled apart. Well, the floodwaters lasted on the earth for about a year. This gives evidence that any of the dinosaurs that would have died in the flood probably would have gotten those stringy fibers in their skin. And then when it mummified, it looks that way. This is not evidence that they turned into birds or evolved into birds. This is evidence that they were in a flood for over a year. But since no evolutionist wants to admit that there was a flood that lasted for a year, they go with the birds. I don't know. A Tyrannosaurus rex femur bone has been found with blood vessels still intact. Again, that's another one that's completely impossible. Now, I don't know how much you know about fossils, but there's a difference between when we dig up a bone and when we dig up a fossil. So a fossil is not actually a bone. Rather, it's when a bone would have made an impression in something like clay, and then minerals would have filled that impression and fossilized, creating a perfect cast of the bone. And so really what fossils are is they're rocks that are in the shape of bones. But actual bones have been found. We have found actual bones. But this would be impossible for anything over several thousand years old. Not to mention any tissue, like we mentioned, these skin things that have been found, blood cells, vessels, proteins that have been discovered. Evolutionists dismiss these findings, and they claim that these findings were presented by, not presented. They actually claim that creationists have been planting this false evidence, but it's not false evidence. They're things that have really been found. They've got no other reason to say that they're false other than the fact that they disagree with evolutionism. But there's not like they're testing them and finding them not to be actual bone or saying this isn't a real dinosaur bone. Everything else is fine, but something doesn't match their theory, so they dismiss it and they claim it's sabotage. Well, that's not true. The general time of death to dust for all physical components in a well-preserved area. So if you're talking best case conditions, not a swamp, but like, cool environment, everything like that. The longest that anything can last, your bones, everything, is about 800,000 years. No more than that. So any remains found have to be younger than 800,000 years. Now I'm going to argue that they have to be less than 10,000 years because I believe that's how old the Earth is, but definitely less than 800,000 years. So, and if it's in good condition, and then it would have to be significantly younger than 800,000 years, because 800,000 years would be worst case scenario or longest case scenario. So there is no evidence for the Earth being millions, let alone billions of years old. Rather, that is just numbers that are made to support evolution, because that's how long it would take for evolution to happen if it could happen. That would have to be billions of years old. But there is just zero evidence found in the fossil record or in digging up things to support that kind of length of time for the Earth. All right, let's take a look at dinosaurs in the Bible. So if dinosaurs existed, it would be likely that they would actually be mentioned in the Bible. So let's look at 4 places in the Bible where dinosaurs are mentioned. The first one is in Job chapter 40, verses 15 through 24, and we're going to look at behemoth. So Job 40, 15 through 24. Look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See how his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees, in a covert of reeds and marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brook surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident, though. The Jordan gushes into his mouth, though he takes it in his eyes, or one pierces his nose with a snare. So we don't know exactly what this is, but one of the things I can tell you is that I believe it's the King James Version calls this a hippo, or hippopotamus. Well, behemoth is not a hippopotamus. First of all, it says he moves his tail like a cedar. And if you've ever seen a hippo tail, it's not like a cedar. It's like a little weed. So this is not what it is. This is pictures more like a dragon. You know, what we depict as a dragon. If you think of, you know, how they are able to lay completely flat and he could get down into a marsh, but also his skin is like armor. No one can bring near a sword. His bones are like beams of bronze, ribs like bars of iron. You know, this is something that is very fierce and powerful, whose mouth is able to open wide enough that entire river can just rush into it. You know, he's not swayed by a rushing river. You know, this is a big animal. This is probably something like some sort of sauropod, although I don't know that a sauropod could get that low. Maybe even something like ceratopsian, like a triceratops, but more likely something else like a plesiosaur or something like that, that would be more dragon-esque in shape. So there's a lot of artifacts in Near East culture that depict sauropods and other animals like this, and also dragons alongside humans and other animals that do exist today. And, you know, Job starts off with, I made along with you. So this is some sort of large, huge animal that we don't have today. And most likely, behemoth was some form of dinosaur. And we still discover all kinds of different dinosaurs today. So it might even be one that we haven't discovered yet. The next one we want to look at is Leviathan. Also in Job chapter 41, verses 1 through 23. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Can you put a reed through... Oh, I just said that. Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you leash him for your maidens? Will your companions make a banquet of him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle. Never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. I will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power, or his graceful proportions. Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? His rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. One is so near another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be parted. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning lights. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Strength dwells in his neck, and sorrow dances before him. The folds of his flesh are joined together. They are firm on him and cannot be moved. You know, in Psalm 104, verse 26, it says, there the ships sail about. There is that Leviathan which you have made to play there. There's actually evidence that shows that the Leviathan actually disrupted shipping lanes, and they had to change shipping lanes to avoid a Leviathan. One of the things I find interesting in the middle of this passage I just read is in verse 8. It says, remember the battle, never do it again. You know, indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. And no one would dare go against him. It's like what is this battle that he's talking about? Apparently there must have been some battle where people decided to try to take out Leviathan, and it didn't go well for the people anyways. I guess it went all right for Leviathan. So there's this sea creature that was out there that people could not destroy, that could not get around, that is mighty and powerful. In fact, it even says it breathes fire. And you might be thinking, whoa, too much. I can't go into that. I can't breathe fire. There are several species of animals that breathe fire that are alive today. There's a beetle in the Amazon that actually has 2 glands in its mouth, and it can secrete it. And when the two whenever the 2 liquids, I don't know what they are, meet in the middle, they ignite each other and it forms a fire. But there's several other ones. There's a fish that actually produces methane gas, and then they have this angle thing that hangs over them that basically has an end of it that's sort of like a flint, and it can bang. There's 2 of them, and they can bang together to create sparks, and it can shoot methane gas and ignite it and basically breathe fire. There are even other methods that animals use to breathe fire. This really happens today. It could have happened there. This just happened to be the largest animal that did it. But this was a very, very powerful animal. Maybe like a mosasaur or something like that. But something very deadly, very strong. And God used it to show Job that God is more powerful than anything created, because he created it. He could bridle it, but no person on earth could do that. So there are old maps. You can go find these old maps where they depict sea creatures that closely match the description of Leviathan. Why did they put these sea creatures in the middle of maps? It's because that's where they were sighted when they drew those maps. And so they knew, don't go through this lane. There's a sea creature there. You will die. So, yes. And now let's look at the next possible dinosaur in the Bible, the Nakash Seraph. I don't know. In Numbers 21:6, it says, "So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died." Well, most people assume that these fiery serpents would be snakes, poisonous snakes, because it bit people and they died. But there's a lot of evidence that these were actually flying reptiles. Even the word seraph is really translated as flying. If you think about the angels that had wings, 6 wings that flew all around, they're called seraphim. So the fact that these are called Nakash Seraph is reminiscent of seraphim. In Isaiah 14:29, it says, "Do not rejoice, all of you Philistia, because the rod that struck you is broken, for out of the serpent's roots will come forth a viper, and its offspring will be a fiery flying serpent." In this particular case, they took the same word, Nakash Seraph, and they actually translated it as a fiery flying serpent. So this is some sort of pterosaur. The Egyptian word seraph, S-E-R-E-F, actually means flying serpent. They had a word for flying serpent. In Egyptian, Incan, and other cultures, they have a lot of depictions of winged serpents, or what they would say is like a precursor to a dragon. But basically, you're looking at some sort of pterosaur. And of course, dragons with wings are very common. Not all dragons are depicted with wings, but many are. In fact, most of the Chinese dragons are not depicted with wings, but many, many are. And ancient Israelite seals have been found with winged serpents on those seals. The French naturalist Pierre Bellon in 1553 wrote a book on observations in other countries, including armadillos, snakes, and flying reptiles. He detailed an encounter with a very dangerous flying reptile located near Mount Sinai. So he was a very good naturalist, not very good at book titles, but excellent naturalist. And he said that there were flying reptiles. And then an account from Josephus. Now, if you don't know who Josephus is, he wrote an account, I can't think of the name of it right now. Anyways, he wrote a book that kind of chronicled a lot of what Moses was doing, but from a different perspective than the Bible. In fact, he looks at the life of Moses while he was actually considered an Egyptian. And while there's nothing in the Bible that tells us that Moses became a general of the Egyptian army, it's usually taken as fact that he was. But that comes from the account of Josephus in his books. So he wrote this little story about Moses in one of his books. He said, "For when the ground was difficult to be passed over because of the multitude of serpents, which it produces in vast numbers, and indeed is singular in some of these productions, which other countries do not breed, and yet such as are worse than others in power and mischief, and an unusual fierceness of sight, some of which ascend out of the ground unseen, and also fly in the air, and so come upon men at unawares, and do them a mischief. Moses invented a wonderful stratagem to preserve the army safe and without hurt, for he made baskets, like unto arks, of sedge, and filled them with ibis, which is an ibis bird, and he carried them along with them. And where in the world Moses got the idea of hiding something in an ark? Anyways, it says, this animal, the ibis bird, is the greatest enemy to serpents imaginable, for they fly from them. And when they come near them, and as they fly, they are caught and devoured by them, as if it were done by the harts. But the ibis are tame creatures, and are only enemies to the serpentine kind. As soon, therefore, as Moses was come to the land which was the breeder of these serpents, he let loose the ibis, and by their means repelled the serpentine kind, and used them for his assistance before the army came upon that ground. So in this account of how Moses came up with this grand idea of how to cross land that formerly was uncrossable because of all the flying serpents, and then he outlays the plan. But the main point I want to walk away from that was, here's another account of flying serpents. And then from Esarhaddon, some guy, he was the king of Assyria in 671 BC. And he gives this account. I'm not going to go into it right now because they just wrote different back then. But essentially, he chronicles his journey and talks about these yellow serpents whose wings were batting. And then they had to march all these double hours and stuff. And there were all these flying serpents. So there's another account of flying serpents. And then Herodotus in the 4th century BC, he describes an encounter with flying serpents. And again, I don't think I'm going to read that either. But again, that's just all these different accounts we have of basically pterosaurs, flying reptiles. And then finally, the last dinosaur in the Bible that I want to talk about is one called Ketos. So in the story of Jonah, the word for what swallowed Jonah is a very general and generic word, and basically can mean anything living in the sea. But in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus retells, or he relates the story of Jonah, and he uses a different word for the animal that swallowed Jonah. In fact, he used a word called Ketos. And in Matthew 12, 39 through 40, it says, "But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." So where it says a great fish, that was the word Jesus used, was Ketos. Well, ancient texts refer to Ketos as marine reptiles, notably large. And in fact, Homer in 9th century BC talks about Ketos, Euripides in 406 BC, Aristophanes in 400 BC, Lycophron in 250 BC, Marco Vero in 100 BC, Diodorus Siculus in 30 AD, Manilius in 1st century AD, Pausanias in the 2nd century AD, Claudius Alenius in AD 200, Oppian of Apamea in AD 200, Eustathius in AD 350, Hesychius in the 5th century AD, and as late as 6th century AD, we have Johannes Moschus talking about Ketos. And they all are talking about Ketos as being a huge, large marine reptile. So different than a fish or a whale. And so there are many places, Rome, Europe, and other places that have these molded images and paintings of sea monsters with this dog-shaped head. And Viking ships often have these carved into them. Jesus' hearers would have completely understood what a Ketos was. They would not have heard whale or great fish. When Jesus said Ketos, that would have been very specific, and the people of that day, because I just went through this list extending from 9th century BC, so 900 BC, I don't know, 900 BC all the way to 6th century AD, so that's like 700 AD or 500 AD, I don't remember how that works. Anyways, regardless, completely spanning over the time of Jesus when he walked on the earth, that word was widely used. And so his followers, his hearers, the people he was talking to would have known exactly what a ketos was. So now I come to this last question. Does a biblical worldview violate science? So we've seen plenty of evidence that the earth is young, that dinosaurs existed alongside people and all of the current animals that exist today. But what about dating? One of the biggest things that people have is, but we've dated fossils and we've proven that they're 65 million, 70 million, 80 million years old. Well, radiocarbon dating is used by archaeologists to determine the age of remnants and artifacts that they believe are thousands of years old. But they refuse to use radiocarbon dating on fossils or dinosaur remains because they're assuming that they're millions of years old. And so radiocarbon dating doesn't work on millions of year old things. So for that, they use something called radioisotope dating, which radioisotope dating only works for things that are millions of years old, or supposedly millions of years old. How can most of the scientists be wrong? If they're dating things and coming up with these answers that I'm saying are wrong, how is that possible? Well, the answer is simply this: worldview. Scientists have been wrong thousands and thousands of times, like the Earth being at the center of the universe, or that there was only ever 4 elements, earth, wind, water, fire. I don't know what they all are. Anyways, at one point, those are the only elements that existed. Well, currently, there's no hard evidence for evolution, but there are just theories that many scientists disagree with, and they actually disagree with the interpretation of the evidence. But secularism prevails in science. So anything that goes against a secularist view of the world is immediately dismissed. So one of the reasons that the radiocarbon versus radioisotope dating is wrong so often is because when they look at a bone, they won't use radiocarbon dating. They go, no, it's a dinosaur bone. So obviously it's millions of years old. So we're not going to use radiocarbon dating. We're going to use radioisotope dating to determine its age. And so therefore, it's always going to be in the millions of years old because radioisotope can only produce results that say millions of years old. But that's just wrong. They shouldn't do that. In Matthew 9:34, Jesus had to deal with people that were not able to think past their own worldviews. In Matthew 9:34, right after Jesus cast out some demons, it says, but the Pharisees said he cast out demons by the ruler of the demons, or by Beelzebub. And, why would they say that? Well, they could not, in their worldview, believe that God was walking among them. And if God wasn't walking among them, no man could cast out a demon. Therefore, he must be talking to the demons in order to cast the demon out. They could not get past their own worldview. In John 10:31-33, it says, then the Jews took up stones again to stone him. And Jesus answered them and said, many good works I have shown you from my Father. For which of these works do you stone me? And the Jews answered him, saying, for a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God. So even though Jesus was doing things to show that he was God, to prove that he was good and doing all this good stuff, they're like, yeah, we're going to stone you anyways, because there's just no possible way you could be God. Now, to be fair, they've been waiting for the Messiah for so long that when he actually does show up, it probably was really difficult to believe. But no matter how much evidence was presented to them, they couldn't get past it and never could believe. People have a hard time getting past their worldview. Well, there are many examples where scientists have dated rocks that were a few thousand years old, and then they discovered something known to be part of a different era. That era was millions of years old. So in other words, you find a rock, you date it, you say it's 1,000 years old, but then you find something else in that same dig, and you say, oh, this is part of a Triceratops. Well, they lived during the Cretaceous period, which would have been 70 million years ago. So therefore, they go, oh, we must have messed up. Now we'll switch to radioisotope dating, and they change the date of that rock to match what they believe about that bone. And there's been several times where they've actually changed results. You can go through and look and see in their records where they've changed the results to match something else that they found. So they changed the dates of their original findings, saying that they made a mistake. And this is very common. Well, let me give you some errors in dating against rocks of known origins. And this chart I've got here, I can barely read it, but this comes directly from this book. So again, remind you, please check out this book. It's very inexpensive. In fact, I'll try to put a link on that in the description. But we can take rocks that we absolutely know when they were formed, and then we send them to a place to be dated, and they do their dating. And so here's some examples. There was a rock found at Mount Erebus that we knew was 17 years old, came from an explosion of a volcano or an eruption of a volcano. And when they did an isotope dating on it, it came out to be 1.6 million years. So slightly off. Also at Mount Etna, some basalt, I don't know what that is, but they had some rocks. One was 29 years old and they dated it at 35 million. One was 37 years old and it was dated at 0.7 million years, or 700,000 years old. Mont Stromboli produced some rocks 38 years ago that were dated 2.4 million years. Kalu'iki produced a rock that was 40 years old and it was dated 8.5 million. There's a bunch of other ones. I don't need to go through all of these, but as you know, some of these are just they're all way off. They're all producing results in the millions of years when we know for sure that these rocks are like 85, 30, 17 years old. So within the fossil record, there's all the evidence that we would expect to see in an Earth that is around 6,000 to 7,000 years old, maybe up to 9,000 years old, and all the evidence that you would need to explain a worldwide flood. Secular scientists have to dismiss this evidence and create complex solutions to explain whatever evidence they do accept to support evolution. In 2 Peter 3:3, it says, "Knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts." In other words, people that are just going to scoff when we bring truth. And they're going to say, there's no way that could be truth. In 2 Peter 2:1, it says, "But there were also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, and bring on themselves swift destruction." So in other words, Peter's prophesying that people are going to scoff in the last days, and he's prophesying that people are going to come in and teach things that are completely false, and that these people will live among us and they're going to bring in destructive heresies, like things that are going to make us doubt that the Bible is really true. And finally, Peter says in 2 Peter 3:5 and 6, he says, "For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water." In other words, Peter actually prophesies that people are going to deny the creation story and specifically the flood. That those two things are going to be denied. And here we are in a situation in a day and age where those things are heavily denied by scientists everywhere. But you know, there is actually a letter that has been circulating amongst many, in fact, thousands of scientists have signed this letter saying that they no longer believe and subscribe to evolution, that they are wanting a different theory. These are not Christians or creationists. These are other scientists saying the evidence is simply not there. We need to move on. We need to find a different theory. If we keep pushing the theory of evolution, we're eventually going to disprove ourselves. And that exists. So anyways, I hope that you've learned something from this. I know this is not completely comprehensive, nor was it meant to be completely comprehensive. If you really want more information, again, I have to recommend Dinosaurs in the Bible by Brian Thomas. Fantastic book. Also look at the Institution for Creation and the Creation Museum. Those have some excellent resources that are available to you. I'll try to put links in the account below, although my YouTube channel is so new that I don't think they're letting me link, but you can like highlight it, right click on it and search. You know how to do that stuff. So anyways, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this. A little bit different than my normal teaching, definitely longer than my normal teaching, and definitely something that would fall more into apologetics. But I hope you learned something, and hey, go watch one of the Jurassic Park movies.